My name's Timothy Hogan. I'll give you a little background about myself real quick. Brother Scott was referring to me as Grand Master. I am Grand Master, Knight Templar lineage. A little bit about my background in family, so you can kind of get a sense of how I got into that position. Great-grandfather, 7 generations back, was General Joseph Warren of the American Revolutionary War. And he was the one who initiated Paul Revere. He was the one who planned the Boston Tea Party. He was the one who... he also died. He was the martyr of the American Revolution. He died at the Battle of Bunker Hill. But yeah, so my middle name's Warren because that was my mother's maiden name. So that was through my mother's side. And now that you have a little bit of an understanding of the importance of the American Revolutionary War and how this all ties in, you can see how that fits in. So he was a Templar Grand Master during the American Revolutionary War. That Templar line through my mom passed down to me. My father, Stephen Hogan, he was a prominent politician here in the U.S. In Colorado, he was a representative in Congress, and he was also mayor of Aurora, Colorado, which was the 50th largest city in the U.S., bigger than Salt Lake City, bigger than Boston, bigger than St. Louis, a lot of major cities. My great-grandfather through his line was Theophil Planck, who was a Swedish Rite Freemason from Sweden. So there's kind of that Sweden tie-in that comes in. Anyhow, when I was only 8 years old, my grandfathers on both sides worked to get me in a system where I could begin being prepared to learn all this stuff. Eventually, by the age of 21, I was I started going through the Masonic system, and then I was parallel to that also learning another Templar system. Eventually I became a Grand Commander. Well, first I was a Grand Preceptor within the French Templar lineage, and eventually then I was also picked to be Grand Master within the same French lineage that related to all of this. So that's kind of how that came to be. And so now I'm Grand Master of the Order of the Temple of Secret Initiates, which is kind of like a United Nations body of different Templar lineages. And we'll talk what that means in a little bit. But this is just kind of giving you an idea of my background. Oh, and by the way, my great-great-grandfather, General Joseph Warren, who I told you about from the American Revolutionary War, his son Joseph Warren Jr. Married Elizabeth Burns, who was the daughter of Robert Burns, the poet, this famous Scottish poet, who was a very prominent Scottish Freemason as well. So we kind of have that family lineage as well. So all of this, what's this to say? It all ties into this whole tradition that we've been talking about. One of the things that my order has been responsible for the last 1,000 years is we have been doing research and exploration in Egypt. And the reason for this is when the Templar Order was originally founded, the stated purpose was it was set up to defend pilgrims in the Holy Land, which is kind of a cover story, right? The order originally came out of, the people who set up the Templar Order originally came out of Gnostic families of southern France in particular, but other areas. They came out of a group known as the Albigensian Cathars. The Albigensian Cathars, they were a Gnostic branch. They referred to themselves as the poor of Christ. And so when the Templar order was founded, when their symbol, by the way, was a red equal-armed cross, which they had inherited through various Gnostic traditions and other traditions going way back in time. So when the Templar order was founded, they called themselves the Poor Knights of Christ, the Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon, instead of just the Poor of Christ, which the Albigensians and Cathars referred themselves. And they also adopted this red equal-armed cross. And there was knowledge being passed down that this idea, this Gnostic idea, Gnosticism was in some way it was a competing form of Christianity with the Roman Church at the time. But the Gnostics believed that they were the true religion going back pre-Cataclysm, and that it was a religion in which Jesus himself had been initiated into, as well as other people, John the Baptist and others, and that it was a religion in which anybody, through their own efforts, could connect with the divine consciousness. And it didn't matter, and they also believed that everybody had the spark of the divine within them. Didn't matter what part of the world you came from, didn't matter what religion you were practicing, everybody had the spark of the divine within them. As the documents that Brother Scott was talking about, where it said, the power of God is within you, right? This was the idea, that this God consciousness is within you. And we're also living in a sea of consciousness connected to the Creator. And that this consciousness was something that transcended duality. So you had to understand the masculine and the feminine aspects of it to fully embrace it. And that anybody, through their own efforts, could tap into this universal consciousness, right? In the Christian Gnostic traditions, this universal consciousness was known as the Christos. We had to connect with that universal consciousness to truly understand the bigger order and to navigate this. And that once we did that, it would open us up to a whole new world beyond what we're perceiving right now. So this is kind of the idea behind it, and we'll get into this some more. But the other thing that the Templars, these families that formed the Templars, believed is that there was a pre-civilization that was extremely advanced and that it had gotten wiped out through a cataclysm, largely a flood, and that there were pockets of survival around the world that were hanging on to the philosophies and were hanging on to the technologies that had survived this flood. And so really, the real reason why the Templar order was founded was because they knew the Crusades were just starting. There was fear that Crusaders were going to get a hold of some of this technology in the midst of fighting, as well as other groups that may not have the best intentions, and that if this stuff fell into the wrong hands, it could cause a lot of problems in the world. And they also knew that the church system of the day would do everything it could to get a hold of this stuff and could abuse it as well. So the idea was the Templar order needed to be started to go out and find these technologies, these philosophies, anything that was left over from this cataclysm, so that they could preserve it. They didn't know exactly what they were going to do with it other than to make sure it didn't fall into the right hands. They saw what the power structures of the day, particularly the not just the church, but also the monarchies throughout Europe who were all fighting with each other. If any of them got a hold of any of this, it could be bad news. So they went down to Jerusalem. They set up shop in Jerusalem. They said that they were protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land, even though what they were really doing was archaeological work. They're digging under places, the Temple Mount. From there, they also went down into Egypt. And while in Egypt, they began researching and digging and setting up shop at all the temples in Egypt. In fact, they set up their main commandery at the Temple of Isis at Philae, and they set up preceptories in a number of other temples. And while they were there, they began doing, they had initiatic work that they were doing. And my order has continued to do that initiatic work in Egypt for the last 1,000 years. So we about once a year, if as long as conditions are okay in Egypt, we go down into Egypt and we continue to do initiations in the Great Pyramid. And that's some of what you're seeing here in these images. But on the back side of the sarcophagus of the king's chamber, there's actually an alpha and an omega that are carved into the sarcophagus, and that was put there by our order, almost 1,000 years ago now. So we're talking way back into the late 1100s, early 1200s. So, but we continue to do the same initiations that we've done there for the last 1,000 years. And to my knowledge, we're the only people allowed by the Egyptian government to do it because we've been doing it for so long. So that's a little precursor image. Let's talk about Egypt, and let's talk about some of the things that the Templar order started finding. And it relates directly to, I think, a lot of what you guys already have backgrounds in, with studying some of the and hearing some of the lectures that were talked about this weekend related to Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, related to ancient technologies, this type of thing. First thing is the ancient name for Egypt was Kem, or Kemet. And this is actually the hieroglyph for it here on the left. And it was that word Kemet, or Kem, meant darkness or black. And it's believed that it related to the darkness of the soot from the Nile that would be deposited on the banks as there's these yearly floodings of the Nile that would take place. And what the Egyptians would do is they would collect this rich deposits, which were fed the crops and everything else. And they had developed a process of refining it. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But this is where the word alchemy comes from. The word alchemy comes from Alchem, or Alchemet, the ancient name of Egypt. And then, of course, this became the precursor to chemistry later on. They just removed the al part of it and called it chemistry. And so that's going to become really important in this discussion. And I'll talk more about it later, but I'll show you the process later. But The point that I want to make is that this science of alchemy involves some very specific steps to refine this stuff, and you're trying to extract very specific things. And it just so happens that this process of how to do this is found all over the ancient world. Whether you go from, you look at ancient Chinese texts on the subject, ancient Indian texts on the subject, ancient Sumerian texts on the subject, come over here to the New World, the Nuwatal cultures like the Mayans. They have the same processes for doing it. Some of the indigenous tribes in North America also pass on the same thing. And they even call it by the same names, Polynesian cultures. And it suggests quite correctly that all of these cultures had inherited this knowledge from a root culture, right? And that it's either that or there was a lot more travel in the ancient world than we're taught, which is also partially true. But I think it more goes back to the root that there was a pre-Diluvian civilization. It's one of those more evidence that there's a pre-Diluvian civilization and that this science had been passed down throughout the world, and they were all calling it the same stuff. So we'll talk about that some. But I just wanted to point this out right from the beginning because we'll be going back to it. And some of the science, so this is right here, this is, I actually took this at the Temple of Seti I in Abydos, where the Templars did a lot of stuff. Right next to it, on the right, you'll see a hieroglyph of a person with wings on a boat. This is the only example of that hieroglyph in all of Egypt. And, it suggests some sort of a flying mechanism, which we will be coming back to as well. So, one of the first things that the Templars started finding as they were going around Egypt, certainly looking around the Giza Plateau where the Great Pyramid is there was evidence of technologies that they certainly didn't have in Egypt, and that we still have troubles with today. And this includes things like on the left you can see the saw marks on this dendrite granite. It's the hardest granite there is. And yet you can see they were clearly cutting into it with a saw. The other thing, too, that most people don't talk about, but is if you do any surveying of the Giza Plateau, you'll find that, yes, there's 2 million stones that make up the Great Pyramid, and that's really impressive. And I don't want to dismiss that. But all 3 pyramids of the Giza Plateau are resting on a platform. That entire area was excavated out, and then there were millions of granite stones that were laid on the platform, and they're all shaped like with just incredible multi-cuts in them. Multi-angled cuts, and so they fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. So almost the foundation of the Giza Plateau is almost more work than the pyramids themselves, and no one talks about that. But just looking around at your feet, you see how these things fit together, and the multi cuts. That's something you see also in places like Peru and Bolivia. And there's a reason for that, which we'll also look at. But again, it's suggesting incredible sophistication On the far right, same types of cuts you find in like the Sphinx temple, right next to the Sphinx. Multi-cut granite, all fitting together perfectly. We call this architecture cyclopedian architecture, and it's earthquake proof. It's the real benefit of it. So if you're wanting to make something earthquake proof to withstand cataclysm, you first of all, you have to have the technology to do it. And then secondly, you have to build it before the cataclysm comes. So that's something to think about. Again, we found more saw marks and also drill holes. I mean, there's been other presentations on that this weekend, so I'm not going to get into it a whole lot. But it does suggest, again, technologies. The other thing that is found in places like, particularly at Karnak, but other places as well, is you find these depictions of, on the left here, this is Tutmosis III treasure house. It's where he's showing all his gold and copper and other things. But he also has depicted, if you look in the right about here, it shows these mound cakes as part of the treasure, and they're described as white gold cakes. And this is something pretty significant that I'll get into in greater detail soon. But you always see in these temples, you'll see these gods or sometimes the pharaohs holding these mound cakes. And they're described as something they would eat, and it was also something that would power things. He also had depicted all his alchemical vessels that he was using for alchemy. So when the Templar order went down into Egypt, and they were looking for these technologies, one of the things that's depicted on all the temple walls, and pretty much all the major temples of Egypt, is these depictions of arks, like the Ark of the Covenant. And always next to the arks are depicted these white cakes, these white gold cakes. And in fact, let me go back. This is at the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. The Templars actually found their first ark. The order found their first ark there. And they found it in a chamber that's kind of the sanctum sanctorum area of that Temple of Seti I. It is now completely closed to the public. The Egyptian antiquities won't let you in there. We have access to it, but part of the reason why they won't let you in there is because it has these depictions. It's kind of hard to see. But up here, this is one of the arks. Depiction of one of the arcs on the wall. And then this is Templar graffiti from the early 1200s, with their red crosses, pointing out that we found one of the arcs here. And this is me, just pointing it out. We have another picture of it here. Here's a little better detail. You can see the ark here. Here's the Templar graffiti from the 1200s. And again, here you see another one of these figures holding one of these white cakes. These white cakes were produced alchemically. Also within this chamber, it shows these arks undergoing transportation, being moved by the Egyptians. And they're always depicted on these boats because it was believed that some of these were flown in, or well, not flown in, sailed in from prior to the last cataclysm. It was believed that these were a technology from the pre-cataclysm, from this previous civilization, whatever you want to call it. Plato certainly called it Atlantis. To me, that's as good a name as any, because we have the same myths in the amongst the Nuado cultures in the Americas that referred to it as Aztlan. So it's not too much of a stretch. And they say they came from Aztlan, and Aztlan was destroyed also in Cataclysm, and they escaped in boats. So, Aztlan, Atlantis, tomato, but they're talking about the same thing. They also show these arcs depicted in different ways throughout the different temples of Egypt. Here you can see this person has like a way to create this, to harness this field that's around here's the arc, and you can see the field around it. You can see their feet are down here. So this arc is levitating. All right, it's literally being depicted as levitating. Or here's another one. This is at the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, where the Templars also had a commandery. It's in a secret chamber there, where it has 4 arcs, and they're issuing forth all this energy out of them. Yeah, they just talk about the energy. They say it's powering the temple, is what they're saying. What we think these arcs are, and we'll get into this a little bit more here. Actually, let me do the next picture. So here's a replica of the Ark of the Covenant according to traditional Jewish sources. Here's a depiction of a replica of the Egyptian arks. You can see they're the same thing. They're these gold boxes with winged creatures or figures on top. And what we're pretty sure they are, what we know they are, is that they're like electrostatic capacitors. They build up electricity from the environment, and then it starts to store it in the box, and then it starts to discharge through the top of it. And what the white cakes are, that white powder, that white gold, they refer to it as, it's a superconductive substance. And when that superconductive substance is put inside the ark, like is described in the Bible, it causes it to just build up a tremendous amount of electricity, which is the reason why you can't touch it, because it would shock you to death. The only way you could open it up is you could take a rod, lay it in the ground, drop it against the ark, and it would discharge the energy into the ground. So then you could open it up. And in the Egyptian hieroglyphs, they depict this as well. But what it's suggesting is that there were probably maybe even hundreds of these arcs all over the ancient world, and that they are probably put at particular world grid points around the planet, specific locations, and they would just transmit power from within the region, especially if they're put in certain structures like the Great Pyramid or other pyramids around the planet or other power centers, and all it would do is it would just broadcast electricity. So it was like what Nikola Tesla was trying to accomplish. In fact, Nikola Tesla, for good reason to believe, was even modeling his experiments off of this ancient technology. He was trying to recreate it. It was just free energy, which would be nice to have again. And God willing, we will have it again in the near future. Here's the if you go to Egypt, they have at different places, including at the the Karnak Visitor Center, and at Luxor itself, and at other places like Edfu, they've recreated these models, these life-size models of these boats with the arcs on them that they just have different places. So I got a couple photos of that. By the way, we have a tour that we go to Egypt a couple times a year if anyone's interested in going, where we have access to all of these secret chambers and stuff that aren't open to the public, where you can actually see this stuff. One of the other things that the Templars came across was the statue. Oops, we'll go back. Keep pushing the wrong. This is the god Amun in the Egyptian tradition. It's where we get the name Amen from. But he was depicted as a ram for a couple reasons. One was because when he was being depicted during this time in Egypt, it was during the age of Aries. So, of course, you'd use a ram to depict a god during the age of Aries, right? But more importantly, related to that is in ancient Egyptian, the name for soul is the word Ba. And, of course, what sound does a ram make? Ba, right? So they would depict the god Amun or Amun-Ra as a ram. Amun just means the hidden one, right? In fact, in one of the evidences for this Egyptian tradition being passed down through the New Testament, through the time of Jesus, is when Jesus is asked in the Bible, his disciples come to him and they say, Jesus, how should we pray? And he says, well, first of all, don't go to the holy places to be seen praying like a hypocrite. Instead, what you need to do is you need to find a dark place in your house, like a closet, where you can hide yourself. Go in and hide yourself in this private place, and then give this prayer. And then he gives the Lord's Prayer of, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven, so on and so forth. Well, this prayer comes directly from the papyrus of Ani, and it was a prayer dedicated to the god Amun, where it began, Amun, Amun, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, as above, so below, so, and so on and so forth. But, and then it ends, of course, with Amun, which, or in the case of the Lord's Prayer, Amen. But Jesus was telling his disciples to become the hidden one, right? To go into the dark place where they can hide themselves and become just the hidden one, Amun. So we also find Amun depicted at Karnak connected to there's what's known as the Avenue of Sphinxes that goes from Karnak to Luxor. And it's a couple miles length, and there's thousands of sphinxes lined on either side of it. But as you start getting towards Karnak, here you have Amun, and the sphinxes are depicted as rams instead of as lions. But at their feet, the bodies are still lions. So they have lion bases with ram heads. And so we have to ask ourselves, what were the Egyptians trying to say here? What the Egyptians were trying to say is that they were worshiping during the age of Aries, which was the time they were around, which was the time of the ram. But their base of where they came from was during the time of the lion, which is Leo, right? So they're saying during the age of Leo, that's where they came out of the Younger Dryas Cataclysm, literally, and they were trying to preserve the knowledge of it during the age of Amun, or the age of the ram of Aries. Now the Templars took these Amun idols, and it was one of the things that they brought back with them, and it later became associated with the Baphomet, right, that they were accused of worshiping when they were persecuted. Well, that word Baphomet just means Ba, right? The first part's Ba, which just means soul. Fa was the ancient Egyptian word, and it's still the Arabic word for from, and Mat. And the Egyptian word Mat meant universal order or truth. So Baphomet literally meant soul from universal order or truth, right? Which was the description of the Gnostic process, right? The soul was an extension from the universal order, the universal truth. Baphomet. That was really the meaning behind it. It was this ancient Egyptian thing that the Templars were coming across. And they learned of it through the Coptic church, which was preserving some of these Egyptian mysteries within it that the Templars were associating with. The other thing they came across, this is a little hard to see, so you're going to have to bear with me. This is at Elephantine Island which is in the middle of the Nile in Egypt, and it's closed to the public, but again, we have access to it. We go to it when we're on our tours. They found depictions of Egyptians. Here's like an Egyptian with he's wearing his horns of Amun, and he's meeting with a Mayan, right? And this is my terrible attempt at trying to draw over it. But really what it is it's an Egyptian meeting with a Mayan, and they're trading beads. Well, that's a problem if you're if you're wanting to accept modern history, standard history, where they say, no one was traveling over to the New World. But here it is on Elephantine Island. This is a temple of Tutmosis III, whereas in the hieroglyphs talk about the two lands on either side of the water, and their brothers on either side of the water. And, the Mayans wearing his big Mayan headdress even. And it was this particular temple, which, by the way, is also said to have one of the arcs, is showing and depicting the people on the two sides of the ocean, and that there was a relation between both. This is one of the things that the Templars came across, amongst other things that were discussing travel on the other side of the Atlantic. Also on Elephantine Island, we find boomerangs, which are, of course, from Australia. And so there's also records of the Egyptians traveling to Australia. And that's not the only place we find that depicted. So I mentioned last night, one of the things that we believe, that we're quite certain of, is that the Egyptians, the pharaohs in particular, were trying to preserve the memory of a time known as the Zep-Tepi, the first time, which was a time really when the people survived this cataclysm, and that they had settled in Egypt. They tried to preserve the knowledge from pre-cataclysmic times, and the technologies, and that one of the places that was originally survival bunkers was the Valley of the Kings. Most people, when you go to the Valley of the Kings, you think of them as just being tombs built in the hillsides. And they certainly are tombs in the hillsides today. But they're also connected by a vast tunnel network that goes deep down into the earth. And all these tombs they're not only are they connected by these tunnels, but just to carve these tunnels out would have, it would have required thousands of workers to do it. If you're trying to keep a place secret, Does that make much sense? It doesn't, right? So what happened is the pharaohs, it's like this place had been preserved in the memory of the pharaohs, right? And thousands of years later, the common people didn't remember it. So when the pharaohs wanted to be buried, they wanted to be buried closer to where their ancestors first came out after the Cataclysm. They first came out of these survival bunkers after the Cataclysm. So the other things that the pharaohs started to do is they started to preserve the memory of that pre-civilization in their tombs at that location. And one of the tombs, this is a new kingdom tomb, right? So it's not even like one of the oldest tombs. It's one of the newer tombs where the pharaohs were still trying to preserve this memory. Here's one of them where they depict different people around the earth. Here's a person with a boomerang. Here's a person with a set of chopsticks, right? We also have these tall white people with red beards. And they have a baby woolly mammoth and a baby sloth. Well, we know there were no woolly mammoths. There's no baby sloths or giant sloths during the time of the Egyptians. They're trying to preserve the memory of it from the time when those things did exist, which was prior to the Younger Dryas Cataclysm. But here it is, being preserved right on a tomb in those same survival bunker areas. They also had these vast tunnel networks under Egypt that when people go to Egypt, they mostly see what's above Egypt, above the ground. But that whole area between Giza and Saqqara, Saqqara is about 20 miles away from Giza, there's vast tunnel networks under there. In fact, that whole region in the Egyptian language was known as Ras Tau. And so Ras Tau in Egyptian, when the Templars heard that, if you transliterate Ras Tau into Latin, which the Templars were familiar with, Ras actually means rose, and Tau means cross. The Templars adopted the symbolism of the rose cross, right? Partially because it was alluding to this region of Ras Tau in ancient Egypt, where all these survivor bunkers and all this technology, evidence of this technology was being preserved. And it was all 200 feet below the sands of Egypt. So this is one of the passages getting down into there, over near Saqqara, and you can actually see all these bricks, these mud bricks, building up the passageway. That's not modern. That was what the pharaohs had erected in order to preserve these tunnels networks that are down there.
In that first image here on the left,
yeah.
So we just got done with a couple of tours, and we visited old castles and cathedrals. And in the upper levels, people don't really notice this, but if you look carefully, you can see that there are walkways way up high in the levels inside these churches and castles. And they're very small. And they're almost exactly like that little hallway there with the rounded arch on the left. And it just occurred to me that and maybe we'll see more of the Gothic architecture, but this is Gothic architecture we were looking at with these passageways throughout the cathedrals that are designed this way, and it's almost like as above later, it was down below in the past. I mean, is there a connection there? Yeah,
those are the passageways to the tunnels that go under Egypt, and they're all. I mean, and I'll show more pictures of this here in a minute, but absolutely this is part of what the Templars were finding as they were going into these areas, this Ras Tau region, right? And we're jumping ahead a little bit, but the cathedrals that you're talking about, which were originally funded and built by the Templars, there's a reason why they built them. If you view them from the air, they look like crosses, and then they have the rose windows. So it makes them rose crosses. Again, Ras Tau, pointing to this region. And then these giant boxes, they keep finding, there's all these giant boxes that are down there. And they're made of different substances. These particular boxes have they're almost like a pressure cooker. That's like a plug in the top, but you can't pull it out. It's like one of these things where the more you try to pull it out, the more it pushes, it keeps itself fit in. It's designed to release certain pressure from the inside, but then to keep pulling it back down. And the only thing they ever found in any of these boxes, in terms of modern Egyptologists, is this white powder. And what this white powder is this substance, again, that was on the walls that I'll be explaining what that is more here in a minute. We have other areas like down in the Serapeum. Again, these are all connected by these tunnel networks. And these tunnel networks are so precise in size, we don't even know how they got these boxes down in them. I mean, these boxes weigh 70 to 100 tons each, and they're pure dendrite. We don't even know how they cut them, to be honest, let alone get them down into these tunnels. I mean, we're talking like 200 feet below the surface.
Could it be that the box predated the construction of the structure? That they were built around these boxes?
Well, the problem with that is that again, you're talking. Well, we know where the granite came from, which was Aswan, which was hundreds of miles away from this region. So they had to have brought the blocks and either cut them down there. They had to have gotten the boxes down there somehow. So the tunnels had to be dug out first before they brought the boxes in. But we don't even know how they moved the boxes, let alone got them down in there, especially in these narrow passageways. Again, suggesting some other form of, this was something certainly that we can't really figure out how they did today. You can imagine how medieval Templars were looking at it. I mean, there was nothing like this. So, yeah, we think probably what the theory, again, it's anybody's guess, at this point what the theory is, but we think that this was part of the survival. These were literally like survival bunker where these boxes, things were being stored in them. That they were designed to withstand whatever the heck the cataclysm was that was happening around them at the time. Those lids are probably 30, 40 tons. Nobody's bothered to try to move the lids because they're too heavy. So they've just left them exactly as they were found. And as how the Egyptians found them too. So, and there's another way you can see how precise it's cut. Here's some more. There's just dozens of these boxes down there, and the only thing that was ever found in some of them was a white powder. There is a faulty Egyptian story that goes around that these were made for giant bulls that they were mummifying, but they never actually found a mummified bull in any of these. They found a bull sacrifice outside the Serapeum that was probably left by the pharaonic Egyptians when they discovered this site. Because when the Egyptians discovered this site, you could tell they freaked out. And so much so that the Egyptians were even going down in there and they were eating dirt off the sides of the tunnels thinking that it might have magical properties or something. They didn't know what to make of it either. They thought it was like the burial places for their gods or something.
Were these found open like that,
Yeah.
or have they been opened?
Yeah, no, they were found open.
Okay.
Yeah, and they just left it. They've left it as they are. I mean, they're too heavy to move, so they just leave them as they are. And they've since built, some of this metal that's around them. That's more recent, just to ensure that there's not any cave-ins or anything. But yeah, I mean, they're huge. In the Egyptian Museum, they have a few of these boxes that they've moved that are unfinished, and here you can see the cut marks on the side of the granite, which were clearly made through some sort of saw, right? And they just hadn't finished cutting the side off, which is pretty amazing. This particular one is rose quartz. Or rose granite, But they're huge. Whoever was cutting them had precision technology to do it. At all of these temples, you'll also find these Templar crosses carved. This is from when any place there was a preceptory or either the commandery or the preceptories or the temple as they're doing research down there. They would carve their Templar crosses on the temples so that you can see it was just a mark that they were there. They even at the Temple of Hathor at Dendera they built a building, a Templar temple just outside of it. This is a group of modern Templars, just holding up a flag there. But you can see up above it the Templar cross above it. That was the outlining the preceptory. Their main commandery was at the Temple of Isis at Philae, and here you can see I'm standing in front or behind the main altar, and you can see there's a Templar cross that was also carved into there. But on top of this altar used to be this statue of Isis with the young Horus made out of black basalt. And what the Templars did, and you also find this image carved on the walls at the Temple of Isis at Philae. And so what the Templars did when they started building the cathedrals, particularly the cathedrals of France, they would, under the cathedral, they'd make a crypt. And in that crypt, they would usually put these black Madonnas. And they were called black Madonnas because they were Madonna and child, but they were painted black. And what they were doing really is they were trying to replicate Isis and Horus from their commandery at Philae in Egypt, at the Temple of Isis. And so they would replicate that with these statues, and then they would put those statues under all the cathedrals. Again, all pointing back to the origins of where they were finding these evidences of this of these mysteries that they believed went back to a pre-Diluvian civilization. Here's more examples of this is again another Templar cross. This is at Temple of Isis at Philae. You can notice there's also these five dots comprising the part of the Templar cross, which is still used by Templars today, those 5 dots. And then this is more Templar graffiti. This is Templar graffiti outside of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera. Here's some more of those tunnels that are all underneath Egypt. And they just go for miles. They got a lot of them. The Egyptian government, and more recent, has put gates and stuff on top of them. Some of them they've put lighting in, so you can so that Egyptian authorities can go in there somewhat. But they just go and go and go. You can see some of these tunnels. this is at the top of one of the tunnels, actually, right here. You can see it on the ground. This is actually going from the Sphinx to the Great Pyramid. So it'll give you a sense of what's down there. There is a tunnel that goes from the Sphinx to the Great Pyramid, and this is the top of it. And people were getting, and this is another thing. History tells us that the Great Pyramid was broken into. It just happened to be broken into at just the right spot, right? But the reality is, it was broken out of. So the way into it originally was through under the Sphinx, through this tunnel. Here's the top of the tunnel going to the Great Pyramid, and you come up through the what's now referred to as the grotto or the subterranean chamber, and you'd work your way up, and you can eventually work your way up through some tunnels into the Queen's chamber and then up into the King's chamber. But and that's where they actually broke their way out of the Great Pyramid. And so what's now said to be the entrance that they broke into is actually where they broke out of. And you can actually see the tool marks of them working their way, trying to break their way out. So the about 800, there was a caliph, sultan in the region. I can drawing a blank on his name at the moment, but he was credited with breaking into the Great Pyramid right there. It just happened to be at the spot where all the tunnels connected, which no one can explain how he knew that right there was the spot to break into. But the evidence is actually that's where he broke out of. And that there's other, even though the Great Pyramid doesn't have any hieroglyphs really on the inside that are verifiable. That's another discussion. But there has been other Greek and Latin characters in there, suggesting that there were other people that had been in there as well previously. So, in the center here, we also have this is right cake. It's supposed to say white cake. That was a typo on my part. But the little this hieroglyph that looks like a spoon here on the left is that's the symbol for white, and then this is a little cake below it, so or next to it, and this is alluding to this white cakes, these alchemical substances they were creating. And here's a depiction of one of these arcs on one of the boats. This is at Edfu, the Temple of Horus at Edfu. This is where the Atlantean myths were recorded on the walls. Where it talks about the destruction of the former homeland that was destroyed in the first times, and then where people escaped on boats and came to Egypt. It's talking about the foundation of Egypt, and you find that at the Temple of Horus at Edfu. But it also has one of these arcs on the inside. These arcs are depicted everywhere. So let's talk about the alchemical process. Right behind the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, where the Templars found that ark, one of the arks, and where their Templar graffiti was, and where there was a lab. As we know, that's where one of the labs was for doing things at the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. Right behind it is an area known as the Osirian, which has these are some of the oldest parts of Egypt, and it has these huge megalithic constructions of rose granite, again from Aswan, which is again far away from this area, and they're all fitted together like jigsaw puzzle blocks. And you see there's this, it's almost like a pipe, and it's coming into this area that floods up somewhat with the water from the Nile. This is where they were collecting material from the Nile. And if in the story of Osiris, in the ancient Egyptian story of Osiris, he's depicted as green at first. In fact, this is the origin of the green man in the later European, this depicted in the later European churches and such. But while he's painted green, he represents this vegetation god. And in the story of Osiris, he's tricked by his brother Set, who throws him in a sarcophagus. He's then chopped up into several pieces that are thrown into the Nile, where he's lost, and his sister Isis goes to look for him. She's worried about him, so she goes to look for him. She starts to recollect all his pieces, puts them back together. She turns herself into a bird and flies around him, and then she lights these oil lamps and incense, and with the help of Sekhmet, the lioness who's the healer, they raise Osiris back to life, and he becomes this new thing. Well, what's being described here is what's known as the standard alchemical process, in which if you're gonna turn something of vegetable matter into something else, what you first have to do is you have to collect the herb, whatever it is, or the plant, whatever it is. You chop it up, just like Osiris was chopped up. You throw it into what's known as a bath, or sometimes it's known as a baptism by water, where you put it in a vessel and you put a solvent in there, which is usually water, but it could also be any number of other caustic substances if you're trying to break down something else like metals or minerals or something. But you put it in there, and you do what's known as a digestion, where you're trying to leach the oils from the original herbal body. From there, then you distill it, which is the process of heating the liquid, turning it into a steam, where it then collects into another vessel, and you can collect the oils from that herb. And this is always represented by birds flying around it, just like Isis turns herself into a bird. So they represented this aspect of the air. And then the last stage you did is you had the remaining vegetable body that you burned down, and you calcinated down to ashes. Just like Isis then burned oil lamps and incense. She was burning things. The fire was introduced. At which point then you could extract the secret salts from the substance. And what this white powder was that they were trying to get to was really the secret salts of alchemy. So the secret salts of alchemy were this white powder. And there were two types of white salts that could be extracted out of any vegetable experiment. One was composed the minerals, the healthy minerals of that herb. The other thing that you could extract was also something that was we now know as monoatomic elements. These monoatomic elements were usually platinum metals that were in a monoatomic state. So they did what that means is they wouldn't. Each atom of the metal was 1 atom thick. So each atom had entered into what was known as a high spin state, so it didn't bind with other atoms. And when that happens, it just appears as this white powder. We know what this white powder is now. I mean, NASA's working with it. Mayo Clinic's also working with it. It's a superconductive substance, and it's also it's great for healing cancer because it works kind of like chemotherapy, which is platinum metals as well, but they're in a heavy metal state so that it poisons you, but it kills the cancer. Well, when it's in a monoatomic state, it's no longer in a heavy metal state, so it's no longer poisonous, but it does the same thing as killing the cancer. So this is why the pharaohs were eating this, but it was also why it was depicted next to the ark, because it was being put into these arks to generate mass electricity. The other thing that happens when this substance is put in a container and it's subjected to a weak electromagnetic or electrostatic field is it causes the container to start to weigh less. It actually produces anti-gravity, levitation. And in fact, this is where the modern term in English, levitation, probably comes from. Who is responsible for carrying the ark? The Levites. So levitation. And we know this is what was going on because if you look at the description of the weight or of what made up these arks, just based on the Bible, it was about 2 tons worth of gold and wood, multiple layers of it, but it would weigh several tons, and yet 2 people with rods could carry it. Well, the only way that would be possible is if something was causing it to lose weight.
So this is the secret of the megaliths, right?
Yeah, so this is the secret of the megaliths, yeah. More than likely what they were doing is we could also use these arcs. They'd put the power source in them, the monoatomic elements, this white powder that they were finding in these boxes, and they would all you had to do was attach one of these arcs to a giant stone, and it would help to cause it to weigh less. It's something that NASA's working on right now for future space vehicles. And I will also point out that in the Bible, this substance was referred to as mana, which in Hebrew just means, what is it? And the reason why it's called what is it is because when you do an analysis of this white powder, if you do a spectroscopic analysis on it by like a burn, you do a burn and you see what color the flame is, it doesn't show up as anything. It's because the outer valence ring is completely captured by the nucleus, while it's in the atoms are in this high spin state, so they don't react to anything else. So that's why it just appears as a white powder. And when you try to do a chemical test on it or a heat burn on it, it doesn't show up as anything. What is it? Mana, right? So this is how they saw this in the ancient world, and it carried over today. But there are other texts in the ancient world that describe this exact same thing. I mean, if you go to, there's an Ethiopian text known as the Kebret Nagast that talks about King Solomon's flying machine and how he would travel from Jerusalem to Egypt in an hour, which would normally take people several days to travel. And it was in this flying machine, and it was all powered by mana. If you go to ancient India, as was discussed by some of the presentations this weekend, the gods were flying around in something known as Vimana, right? If you look at the ancient Sumerian myths, they talk about the Anunnaki, the gods, and they had these flying machines that were known as Shimana. And by the way, the science for creating this Shemana, according to the ancient Sumerian myths, was something known as Graal, Gra.al. Sound familiar? Grail? Right, exactly. You go to the Polynesian cultures, they refer to manna that could be extracted out of nature. You go up into some of the Tibetan traditions, it was referred to as mani, same substance. In fact, if you ever heard the Tibetan chant Om Mani Padme Hum, Om is the word of creation, Mani was the precious stone, or the precious jewel, the mana. Padme was the crown chakra. It was the lotus, the opening of the lotus, and Hum was completion. So this was the process. You did the Om, you ingested the mana, opened your crown chakra, and you repeated the process. Right? We're talking about the same thing all over. In fact, in the New Testament, it refers to he who overcometh will be given the hidden mana and the white stone, and in the stone a new name written. If you heat this mana to the right temperatures, it'll actually kind of turn into a glass substance. And you see this in the New Testament too, where it says this New Testament that the New Jerusalem is made of gold that looks like glass. Well, that's what happens when you take monoatomic gold and you heat it to make it look like glass. So we're talking about alchemy here, right? And it all goes back to Egypt. I'll show more examples of that here. The other thing we see in Egypt, and this is that the Templars came across, and this is closed to the public. If you go into the sanctum sanctorums of all the major temples, there were 7 main pharaohs in antiquity that were said to be guarders or protectors of the Stargates. And on the outside of every one of these sanctum sanctorums, they have this symbol, Saba, which means Stargate. Some people believe this is where the word Sabaeans or Sabaeans comes from. And they have these depictions of these Stargates. This one in particular, this is the inside of Hatshepsut's funerary temple and the Sanctum Sanctorum. This particular Sanctum Sanctorum is guarded 24/7 by guards. And no one's allowed in there. If the guard gets caught letting you in there, he'll go to prison for life. That's how serious they are about people not going in there. We do have access to it, and this is one of the photos of what's in there. But it shows the pharaoh opening the Stargate. Here's all the stars in the gate, and what's depicted as going in and out of there are these gods that are teaching the pharaohs, which is pretty far out. What's that?
Time travel?
Possibly, yeah, time travel, or it's connecting with our cousins out there in space somewhere. This sign right here, if you go to all the temples in Egypt, this is at the base of every pillar in all the temples of Egypt. And what it means is a hieroglyph that means received from the stars. So that's a weird emphasis, that's being put on all of these temples, and that there's these Stargates being depicted on all of the major temples in Egypt. There are lots of hieroglyphs.
And what do they say?
I have not been able to translate them because the times I've been allowed in there have only been for a couple minutes, and we're not allowed to take pictures. So this is an illegal picture. I hope to get more illegal pictures in the future so I can translate the hieroglyphs. But the only thing I can tell you is it talks about again, it's talking about the Pharaoh receiving their wisdom through these Stargates. Most of these, it also emphasizes certain constellations, including Orion, the Pleiades, primarily. They just have a sign that says, you're not allowed in here. Guards don't let anyone in here, and they have armed guards there 24/7, which makes so much sense for an archaeological site, right? Doesn't make any sense. Pharaohs are all being fed this manna, and then they have these erect phalluses. The belief is that it's Viagra. No, I'm just joking. But it is believed that it's so energetic, it's bringing vitality and life force to the Pharaoh. You know, part of what's not only helping him heal, but is also, actually bringing vitality to them. It is very similar, but this is meant to be a gate. So literally, this is Stargate. That's the symbol, Egyptian symbol for gate, but it does look like a T-pillar. And maybe, there's something to that. I don't know. All right, keep going. So the other thing that, this is Aswan in Egypt. This is where they're getting all this granite from. And one of the things that's left there is this giant unfinished obelisk. Some people say it was left there on purpose as a hallmark to the technology they used to have. Some people say they left it there because it got a crack in it, and so they just left it. But this obelisk, all the obelisks are huge in Egypt, but let me go back. But this particular one, God, I keep pushing the wrong green button. Here I'm pointing it out. You can see here's a person standing on it. This obelisk is over 1,000 tons. We couldn't move that today. The only stones I've seen that are just as big are at Baalbek in Lebanon, and there's a couple of huge stones under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But traditional Egyptologists will say, oh, well, what they did is they carved this stuff out of the granite, and then they brought it down to the Nile, and they put it on boats in the Nile, and then they just sailed it up the Nile. It's a good story, but the problem, there's several problems with this. The first is that between Aswan and the Nile is a mountain range, so you'd have to get it up the mountain range first of all, and then back down to the Nile. And that's a problem. The second is, how are you moving 1,000-ton stone to even attempt to do that? And then third, how are you going to get it on a boat? Let's be real. So there's lots of problems with this story, let alone how they even cut it. If you go to Aswan today, they'll show you this ridiculous video of people using dendrite stones to hit the granite to eventually break it down to do this. But in order to do that, it would take the amount of time it would take to do that, even with hundreds of workers. It would take. They'd have to be working 24/7 for maybe 100 years. Just to cut one side. It's ridiculous. So,
how about no?
Yeah, that's no. So clearly there's other things going on here. And anyhow, so the Templars started discovering all this, and they recognized that there was these great mysteries in Egypt that where this technology, evidence of this technology, the lost technology, was preserved. As well as the philosophies, which they carried over into their own practices, and they recognized within their own Gnostic traditions. This is at the former Templar commandery in Istanbul. This is actually the building where Hugh de Paynes and Godfrey de St. Omar were first initiated and given the mandate to start the Templar order, but it later became a Templar commandery. And So they carved on one of the pillars there, and this is, by the way, this is the oldest depiction of the square and compasses found in Europe. They carved square and compasses next to an Egyptian ankh because they're pointing to their tradition and where it came from. And in this building, which still stands, it's built like the building itself is built like a giant beehive, and with honeycomb-shaped floor tiles, and it also has a crypt that's still there to this day, where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Templars are all buried together in the crypt underneath. There's actually a replica, almost exact replica of this building in Minnesota at the cemetery there.
Lakewood Cemetery.
Lakewood Cemetery, yeah.
And they have a crypt down there with interesting Templar symbols.
Yeah, and the crypt is in the same place as it is in this one in Istanbul. So the other thing that's interesting, by the way, at this building in Istanbul, is there are certain ceiling tiles in the building in Istanbul that have somatic music designs on it. And somatic music design is where you take a drum, you sprinkle sand on it, you hook that drum up to an instrument, you can play a note on the instrument, it causes the sand to vibrate on the drum, and the sand will organize into different geometric patterns depending on what the note is that you're playing. Well, this was supposedly discovered in the 1800s, and yet here it is on the ceiling tiles of the former Templar commandery in Istanbul. Well, the only other place in the world where we find these exact same somatic designs is at Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. So anyone who says that there's no proof that the Templars built Rosslyn Chapel, never mind the fact that William Sinclair's grave is there in the chapel and it says William Sinclair, Knight Templar. But even if you want to ignore that or say that was a later addition or whatever, the fact that there's these somatic designs in both locations, and they're the only two locations from that time of history, proves that there was a Templar connection. So.
Well, and in the journals, we have the entries of William the Builder Sinclair, who built Rosslyn, and in one of the entries after he comes back from visiting the Templars that his grandfather had left behind in the New World, and he visited with them, and they heard stories about his grandfather that he never met. He resolved in his journal to build an edifice in stone in honor of his grandfather and the knights who stayed behind, the Templar knights who stayed behind, that were the descendants of those that escaped in 1307. So we have it in writing that supports exactly what you're suggesting.
Right. So let's talk about this white powder again real quick. So here's again one of these cakes. Here you see the pharaoh holding it. Why is it in this shape? Well, let's look at this. One of the ways to extract it is you take vegetable matter like a bush and you burn it down. Hence, maybe the why Moses witnessed God as a burning bush. All right, and also why the Hebrew priests demanded all these burnt sacrifices in antiquity. So you take the ashes and you cook it. You cook it in acid. Then you filter it, and it will start to. You do the special process to it where it'll start to filter out, and as it falls to the bottom of the container, this is how it falls. It falls into this mound shape, just like what they're holding in their hands. So then you take that and you would clean it, and it'll settle on the bottom, and then you can dry it out, and you get this white powder. It's similar. Yeah, absolutely. He was talking about similar stuff, but this is where it comes from. right? He never really got into the origin of where it came from, right? But this is, just going back, and this is the main part. Is, again, it settles. As it starts to settle, it forms this mound shape, just like what he's holding, and that's really the origin of it. So this alchemical process, which was in ancient Egypt, had been preserved by certain traditions in Egypt. It was taught to the Templars. The Templars carried on the process. The completion of the alchemical work, according to the Egyptian tradition, was to make something known as the benben, which meant, ben means both light and stone in Egypt, ancient Egyptian. So the benben is the light stone. Interestingly, as the benben is depicted sometime, it's depicted as this almost like this pyramidum, where it has this little window with the people in it, which looks very much like a capsule from a Saturn V rocket, right? Where they're looking out. And it was deemed to be, you could use it as some sort of a vehicle or the power for a vehicle to go into space. That's how the Egyptian texts describe it as, and it's likely why NASA is looking into it now. But again, it's applying a lost technology from antiquity. We talked about, out of the Knights Templar, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, formed Freemasonry. One of the primary utilities of Freemasonry, and anybody who goes through the Masonic degrees are taught this whether they realize it or not, is Freemasonry is designed to give people the tools, all the tools that they'll need if they understand the full Masonic system. Not only will they understand the historical implications of where these technologies came from, there's a lot of emphasis on the Ark. I mean, everyone knows Freemasonry is obsessed with Solomon's Temple. Well, why was Solomon's Temple built? It was built to hold the Ark. And what did the Ark hold? It held the manna. But contained within the Masonic system is designed to give people all the tools to rebuild civilization should it collapse again. It's looked at the past, that there was this cataclysm, there was this attempt to preserve any knowledge, philosophy, whatever that we could out of it. This is what the Templars did. This is what they were trying to collect. I mean, 1,000 years ago, not only were the Templars doing all the study in Egypt, but within Egypt, it also led them up into places like Göbekli Tepe, where there's Templar graffiti to this day from 1,000 years ago. And what they were trying to understand was what happened during the Cataclysm. What can we gain from that cataclysm? How can we rebuild the new Atlantis? And then how could we preserve knowledge should the cataclysm happen again? So Masons are taught things like trying to understand and know the 7 liberal arts and sciences. These are things you're going to need to know to rebuild civilization. They're taught things about how to governmental structure. They're taught things contained within the degrees are the secrets of this alchemical process, so people can make their own medicines. You're not going to be able to go to the pharmacy, after civilization collapses. You're going to have to be able to extract it from nature. All of these things are contained within the system, whether Masons realize it or not. And so when the United States of America was set up, it was set up to become the new Atlantis. And in fact, Francis Bacon, in his book, The New Atlantis, and he was a Templar, there's a very interesting story in the New Atlantis. It talks about how there were these people that shipwrecked on an island, and they referred to themselves as the College of Solomon. And the head of the College of Solomon was wearing a turban with a red equal cross on it, which was, of course, the Templar symbol, right? And they're on this island, and one night they looked out, and they saw and by the way, this island was in a place where they knew where they were, but the rest of the world didn't know they existed. So they're living on this island, and one night they look out and they see this light in the sky that seems to be hovering there. And it almost looks like a cross. So they sail their boat out to it, and then there's some sort of force field that's keeping them from getting any closer. What does this sound like? Does it sound like a UFO? So then this UFO, or whatever, this light in the sky, spits a book out to them. And in the book, it describes how to create all kinds of new technology and new medicines and everything else. So then the College of Solomon goes to work building these technologies in order to create a new Atlantis. Well, that is the blueprint for what was to become the United States of America, or the Free Templar state. And it's a short book. It's an unfinished book that Francis Bacon wrote, but it's one of the earliest books to describe a UFO in our modern world, and it's connecting it directly to Atlantis. And and by the way, Francis Bacon was the son of Queen Elizabeth I, who had been hidden at birth. And Queen Elizabeth was a Templar, as was her son, Francis Bacon. There's a German document from 1598 known as the Neometria that's dedicated to this underground Templar body, which at the time referred to itself as the Militia Crucifera Evangelica. It lists Frederick, the Duke of Württemberg, as the Grand Master at the time, and that Queen Elizabeth I was a member, as well as other people. And it was published at the exact same time that in 1598, 1599, that the Shaw Statutes of Scotland were also published. The Shaw Statutes were one of the first documents ever to outline the role of Freemasonry in the United Kingdom, and particularly in Scotland, where it outlines, it's the first document to outline what were known as Masonic penalties. And these penalties corresponded to alchemical processes. So all of this was orchestrated, and it was all coming out at the same time, because by this underground Templar movement that was starting to recollect itself. And out of that formed the same people that published that document in Germany of the Neometria, the Templar tradition. They're also the ones who started the Rosicrucian tradition. In fact, Johann Valentin Andrea, who helped write the original Rosicrucian manifestos, he was a member of this Militia Crucifera Evangelica, as was his mother, who was the town alchemist. So, it's all there once you know what to look for. But all of this was planned to create a new Free Templar state, also known as the New Atlantis, also known as the New Jerusalem. And so this is why, as the United States of America was being planned, part of what was starting to be utilized from the very beginning was all of these Egyptian symbolism. This giant obelisk for Washington Monument, the Great Seal of the United States. By the way, if you draw a seal of Solomon over this, where the points of the seal will touch They go up here on the top of the eye, above the eye in the triangle, and then the other points all touch the letters Mason. Which could either be Mason or almonds. But we're talking about, some code that's going on there. But even the layout of it, the original plan for Washington, D.C. itself was as an Egyptian necropolis. This is the original plan for Washington, D.C. And they ended up not making the Egyptian necropolis, which is probably for the better. But the symbolism's still there. This is the one of what's known as Cleopatra's Needles, which is one of the obelisks of Tutmosis III that was moved there by the Masons of New York, helped to get that moved there and dedicate it. There's another one of these in London, the park in London. There's another one in Paris. There's another one at the Vatican. And there's another one in Istanbul. By the one in Istanbul is within 5 minutes walking from the, maybe 10 minutes walking distance from the former Templar commandery there. And it's right in line with another monument. And I can tell you that there's also a Templar vault that's there in Istanbul that's right in line with all that the Vatican tried to break into 10 years ago because there's still certain artifacts that are in there. This is also really the reason why we have the Statue of Liberty. So to understand the Statue of Liberty, you have to understand that, and I'm almost done here, but the Statue of Liberty was originally created to be a statue of Isis. In fact, it was created for the Suez Canal, to be on top of the Suez Canal in Egypt when the Suez Canal was being built. And so it was supposed to stand over the Suez Canal in Egypt and be a statue of Isis. It's all fine and good, except for the depiction of it is of what in the ancient world was known as the goddess Sophia. Sophia was a Gnostic concept that was taken out of the Egyptian myths. And so Isis became this goddess known as Sophia. Well, Sophia just means wisdom. And in fact, when Pythagoras coined the term philosophy, comes from Philo, lover of Sophia. And Sophia also means wisdom. She was a goddess, but she also meant wisdom. And according to the Gnostic tradition, Sophia had incarnated down onto our plane, our dimension, our earth. And she got completely absorbed in it. She got completely overrun with her senses. She became so titillated by the earth that she started copulating with everything in sight. In fact, some of the texts say. I mean, she just became overwhelmed and lost in her senses. And she became a slave to them. So at first she became the slave to our plane. Eventually, she kind of worked her way out of it, and she became liberated from it. She became free from her addictions. And she started to work her way back towards the universal consciousness. And eventually, she wed the Christos, which was the universal consciousness. And when this happened, gnosis took place, or experiential knowledge. And then she became the enthroned Sophia. She became the goddess of wisdom that presided over this world trying to help direct the rest of us to eventually achieve liberation ourselves and to open our consciousness to this greater consciousness that, like she did. And so the Gnostics viewed her not only as a goddess, but she was also emblematical of our own human soul, who incarnates in this world, gets caught up in it, but then eventually works our way towards uniting with the universal consciousness again. And once we're able to do that, we transcend this dimension into higher dimensions. And we have a whole nother life beyond this. And that's the Gnostic idea. So this was fundamental to the Templar belief system. It's why they were so obsessed with, like in Egypt, all the temples that they set up at were all the temples of the goddesses. Temple of Isis, Temple of Hathor, and then when they came to the United States and they were trying to set up this free nation, the Freemason who designed the Statue of Liberty, which was originally for Egypt, but then given as a gift to the United States, is depiction of Sophia with her 7-pointed crown, which was emblematical that she had overcome her 7 psychic centers, also known as 7 chakra, and they were now being celebrated or extended through her crown chakra, right? In the Templars also looked at this as the 7 seals before Revelation, and that each seal was being closed by certain vices, also known as the 7 deadly sins, and that those 7 deadly sins could be overcome through the 7 virtues, which were the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 heavenly virtues. The 3 heavenly virtues were faith, hope, and charity. The 4 cardinal virtues were temperance, prudence, justice, and fortitude. So, like, for example, prudence overcame lust, or temperance overcame gluttony, and so forth. So by practicing these virtues, they had overcame the 7 deadly sins that kept those 7 blockages closed, those 7 seals closed. And with the opening of each seal, our old perspective of the world dies off, and our new perspective of the world opened up. So it wasn't like really the end of the world. It was the end of our old perception of the world. And that once we attained all 7, we reached the 8th sphere, which was known as the Agawad. This is why the number 8 was also very important, because it represented the state of gnosis. In fact, in Greek gematria, which is in Greek, also in Hebrew, every letter also corresponds to a number. And the name Jesus in Greek adds up to 888 or 888, representing the Agawad, the 8th sphere. Also in Revelations, where it says the 7 churches, it keeps referring to the 7 churches. Well, the 7 churches in Greek gematria, where you replace every letter for its number and then add up the sum of all the numbers, the 7 churches adds up to 888 also. Right? So it's alluding to the Agawad, the 8th sphere. So, this was fundamental to Templar ideals. This is also why their churches were built with 8 sides. And you also see this in other architecture. But you had to open the 7 seals first, and so that's what her 7 crown represented. She had the torch of knowledge. She was holding traditionally she held like a tablet of knowledge. In this instance, she's holding a a tablet that says July 4th, 1776, but it's in the shape of a cornerstone or of a keystone,
Like the Newport Tower.
like the Newport Tower. And at her feet, it shows broken chains because she's been liberated from slavery of the senses. Yeah. I mean, the only reason why the kings wore crowns is because, again, it represented that opening of illumination of the crown, what we now call the crown chakra, or what in Eastern traditions they call the crown chakra. You know, it was emblematical of that. The same type of idea. They didn't have necessarily 7 points like hers does, but yeah, this is the real origin of it. And by the way, the other place where you know where the other place is where you find this Statue of Liberty, the exact same depiction of it. No, I wish. No, it's actually found at Notre Dame Cathedral in France. And it's there for a reason as well, because Notre Dame, Our Lady, as we talked about, has been talked about, really represented the same concept. And that, in fact, Notre Dame Cathedral was built on a former temple of Isis. Well, actually, it was originally built on a Merovingian church. Site of a Merovingian church which was previously the site of a temple of Isis. If you look at the earliest map of France, it highlights the temple of Isis at that location. So again, it was just the same tradition that was being passed down over time that the Templars were trying to preserve and bring to the United States of America. So, but there's other landmarks related to this new Atlantis around the U.S. This is the largest indoor statue in the world. It's a statue of Athena at the Parthenon, recreation of the Parthenon in Tennessee, and in Nashville. Athena was of course, what Athens was named after in Greece, but according to Plato, Athena was also the goddess of Atlantis, and Poseidon was the god of Atlantis, and so hence why he had the trident symbol. According to Templar tradition, the story of the Merovingians really, coming out of the ocean, this Merovi being connected with this being that came out, the sea monster, or this sea creature that came out of the ocean, was the same stories that you find in the ancient Babylonian and Sumerian myths that talk about these beings wearing fish skins coming out of the oceans and resetting up civilization, which was Atlanteans after the Cataclysm. It was preserving the Atlantean tradition. And this is why the Merovingians assumed the symbol of the fleur-de-lis, which was really just the trident of Poseidon. In the Babylonian and Sumerian myths, they talk about the god Oannes being one of these figures. Oannes came out of the ocean. He baptized priest kings, taught them how to set up civilization. Well, Oannes' feast day was June 24th. Okay? Same feast day as John the Baptist. John in Greek is Ioannis, right? Ioannis became Joannes in Latin, which became John in our normal human vernacular. The story of John the Baptist, or Joannes, is the story of Oannes. Just as John was said to wear animal skins, Oannes was said to wear fish skins, right, as he came out of the ocean. It's the same idea being passed down. I mean, there may have actually been a John the Baptist. I'm not saying there wasn't a John the Baptist. I'm just saying this earlier story, it was alluding to this earlier tradition that was grafted onto him. This is all part of this tradition, going back to this pre-cataclysm, right? Since the time of the Templar suppression, and then the recreation of some of the Templar tradition within Freemasonry. And by the way, that was a very easy transition for them to do, because the Templars were already building cathedrals and Gothic structures all over Europe, Cistercian abbeys they were creating, and the Templars had, most people think of them as knights, which obviously they were, but they also had farmers, they had sea captains, they had clerics, and they had stonemasons. In fact, according to the Templar rule, which is like their book of constitutions, or their guide for how to do conduct, the only people that were allowed to wear white leather gloves within the Templar order were the priests and the stonemasons. And so that was one of their hallmark symbols. And when the Templar order was suppressed, it was very easy for them to just disguise themselves as stonemasons, which were the only people that were allowed to travel between kingdoms and continue their work. In fact, even to this day, the people who are responsible for restoring the cathedrals who are said to have built the cathedrals were a group known as the Companions. And the Companions are divided into two groups. One is known as the Children of Solomon, and the other is known as the Children of the Master Jacques. And if you talk to those groups, the Children of Solomon will say that their name comes from originally being the children of the poor knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon. So they just changed their name to the Children of Solomon, and that was the original name of the Knights Templar. And they say they were the building force of the Knights Templar. And the Children of the Master Jacques say they were also originally came out of the Templars, and the Master Jacques was Jacques de Molay, who was burnt at the stake in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. Both these traditions, which are still now today responsible for restoring the cathedrals, say they came out of the Knights Templar. So it was very easy for them to transition from that operative cathedral building into speculative Freemasonic work. So this is just like a little bit of a sampling of how the Templar work started out looking at pre-cataclysm stuff. They were trying to find the evidence of pre-cataclysm stuff. They found it. They started trying to bring that back into Europe to help get Europe out of the Dark Ages, trying to preserve that knowledge. And then they set up systems to ensure that should that cataclysm ever happen again, there are people that have the skills to rebuild civilization. And that continues to be the mission to this day. So I know some of this may have seemed like, well, what does this have to do with cosmic impacts or pre-Diluvian civilizations? But this is how it ties in. So, we don't know what's in the bags. We don't know. I mean, they do show up all over the world. Some people think they could be battery packs. Some people think they could be full of the seeds of civilization. Some people think that they could be psychedelics. Some people think they could be mana. Certainly, the alchemical process, I believe, 100% was being spread and taught all over the ancient world, which is why we find the same names and the descriptions of the exact same processes. I mean, I've gone down and I've met with Mayans down the Yucatan, and they have the exact same ceremonies, initiation ceremonies that the Templars did. And part of that is because I thought, I knew that there was Templars going down there and meeting with them in antiquity and trading silver and such. So I thought, well, maybe they learned the initiations from them. But actually, they, in recent years, they had taken apart one of their pyramids to build fences, which is kind of a sad commentary, but they found within the pyramid not only mortar and pestles, which is used for grinding down herbs and stuff, but they found jade masks, and they also found statues in there performing these rituals. And in the rituals, the shamans were wearing an apron with an all-seeing eye on his chest. And he performs this ritual where he does a death and raising ceremony that is identically found in all Templar traditions to this day. Those were carbon dated, these figurines, and they all date to around 800, which is prior to the Templar order ever being founded. But in memory, or at least in conjunction with the Templar tradition, I think when they were meeting with each other, when the Templars were going down, the Templars figured out that from the Egyptians were going there, amongst others, to reconnect. So they went down there. And so to this day, the Mayans have an altar that's based off of the squared circle, which is really goes back to that symbol of the square and compasses, right? Because you have to use the compasses to make the circle, and you have to use the square to make the square. But their altars are based off of the squared circle, and on every altar they put an equal-armed cross, Templar cross, to this day. And they mark their ritual spaces with this equal-armed cross as well, because of these Templar connections. And we also do a tour down to the Yucatan, so you can see these things for yourselves, where we meet with the tribes and such and participate in the rituals with them. But their rituals involve this alchemical process, the same alchemical process. So my point is, it's being preserved all over the world. And by the way, all of the centers of preservation, the reason why they can recognize you as being connected with them is they all have the exact same secret hand grip that's passed on in the Templar tradition. So that's why Lewis and Clark, when they went up and they were traveling across the Louisiana Purchase, they were able to give this grip to certain tribes who immediately recognized it. It's recognized amongst the Druze in Lebanon. It's recognized amongst certain Sufi traditions. It's recognized amongst certain Kabbalistic traditions. It's recognized amongst the Mayans. It's recognized amongst the Hopi and other tribes, the Mandan, the Mi'kmaq, and others. And it's preserved within Freemasonry as well as other Templar traditions. So it suggests that, at least according to the Hopi, they say this grip was given to everybody right before the last Cataclysm. And it was a way for them to recognize each other again once they come back together. And that's exactly what we've done. So and all of these cultures that preserve this grip are preserving these alchemical knowledge, the same alchemical knowledge, which again suggests we all learned it from the same source, pre-cataclysmic source. So, yeah.